So it's my understanding that Denim Day is a day to discuss rape. I saw a little poster in the science building about a video contest. And I'm not a filmmaker and I don't really aspire to anything too fancy, but I just thought it might be fun to share with you guys that I was raped. I was raped multiple times, but the first time was actually somebody who went to my school, a very prestigious school in the South, and it was at a party, and I said no, and he just was like too drunk and proceeded to do what he did, and it was a bad experience. But the next time was really frightful and life-threatening. I had been staying at home doing art, like reading, doing my normal thing, and then I thought, oh, I need a walk today, man. This news has been so depressing. This was 2002, and I'd heard these soldiers came back from Afghanistan, four of them, and all killed their wives because of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the news just filtered through me, and I felt panicked and sad and depressed. And then two of them had taken the gun to themselves, so it was like a double murder suicide. And I thought, well, if I take a nice walk, I'll feel better and I'll go to the cafe or go to the club. So I walked across town through my old campus, looked at all the beautiful trees and landscaping, and then came to this club where I had been invited to a birthday party, and they didn't like what I was wearing, so I didn't get in. And then I went and had a glass of wine all by myself at this restaurant, which I would normally not get anything too fancy, and that was like inexpensive or something. So then I was like, okay, what next? So I thought, oh, well, I'll walk to this cafe where they have a lot of my art. I had donated a lot of my art there, and I walked all the way up there and then proceeded to look at my phone and probably look at the books and whatever things I had brought along with me in my bag. And then I was being persistently badgered by someone who wouldn't leave me alone. And some other guy who was very obviously drunk was like, hey, I'll give you a ride home. And by that time, the hour was getting quite late. And I just tried to wait it out and go from room to room and try to avoid this person who was glomming onto me like crazy. And then I was in the front patio trying to avoid him, and then he found me again, and I was kind of getting used to it at that point, and like having worked in bars and for years, like I'm used to annoying people, so I can usually deal with it with a certain amount of level head despite displeasure. So then his friend brings up like this sports car, and he's like, "Oh man, hey, come check out the sports car. I want to show you the stereo system. It's like a two-door coupe." He opens up the door. It's this old like 90s turntable, all these CD things. And he's like check this out, the sound, and look at the speakers. And then pops the seat back. They hop in, slam the door, and they go. And I'm just like, oh man, I'm being abducted. I'm going to be taken to the middle of nowhere. I'm going to be taken to the deep, deep south and sold into slavery. I'm going to end up dead or my body scattered in a million pieces. And so then they took me to this guy's apartment. They pulled me up the stairs. I was like, like clinging to the banister, like, oh my gosh, I want to jump off. I don't know what's going to happen, but I suspected it would be like a gang rape, and I didn't know who would be inside. And then there was this like little kid, which they basically had like co-opted his apartment and broken in and changed the locks, is what he told me later. But then like they brought me into this apartment and they were like, here, put on this robe. And I'm like, oh great, so you're just like demanding me to take off my clothes. Awesome. And so I was wearing like multiple layered pairs of pants and a huge sweatshirt. And at the time I had very short hair, like shorn hair, like a tomboyish hair, like about this short, maybe like that short, like extremely short. So I'm thinking like I'm not that glamorous here, and so then
It's 21:45.
I go to the bathroom and I'm like, oh my god, I'm going to be raped. I knew it. That was the vibe. The vibe was 100% creepy. So I was thinking, well, it's going to be a lot harder to pry my jeans off me if I get totally wet. So I got the shower going and got totally wet, and then locked the door. And then eventually he broke down the door, and I struggled with him a good bit. I had taken the porcelain top off the toilet and was like ready to like throw it down, but he somehow like wrestled it out of my hands. And then he began screaming at me every word you could possibly imagine. and I had these long earrings on, and he was like pulling my ear saying, I know what you want, I know what you want, but like with all these like really negative epithets, which I really don't like to hear ever since this happened. And then it was just like screaming at me, and then I'm trapped in this tiny little bathroom, and then he's like gets my clothes off of me, and I could go nowhere, and I was trapped, and he was stronger than me, and he overpowered me. And then I finally broke out of the bathroom, and there's his little friend and accomplice who wasn't as big and strong as him, wearing a condom, like he's next. And like he kind of, I'm like at this point like pretty much in shock and weak and like disgusted. And his little friend, I'm just like, gross, get away from me. Like, and he was just wimpy. And I'm actually very strong for a person my size. And then it's just like a tiny little studio apartment. And then like monster comes after me again, and it's like I'm fighting him off and like kicking him off with my legs, and then now I'm out in the open where I know the windows, like the sound could transmit. I'm not trapped in the little bathroom in the corner in the dark. My screaming reflex kicks in, so I just begin screaming like bloody murder. And it's like that dream you had as a kid hundreds of times where you're in a fire or you're in some kind of danger and you don't know if you can scream, but then all of a sudden like you know you can. And it was like then that I was like, my life force was like really strong. So I'm like screaming like crazy. And I'm thinking like I'm completely naked. He's like taken off all my clothes. And I'm thinking like if only I could get out onto the street and run straight through the streets completely naked to safety. Somebody would help me, police. And I was actually like, knew my way around the city. Like I was actually about a mile and a half from where my mother and my father lived. So like, so then, like, he rolls me over, and I'm still screaming, and he puts his hands around my throat until I see stars, and he's like on top of me, and I'm leaning down on the floor, screaming for my life, and like screaming in shock, and he's got his hands around my throat, and he just tells me like, stop screaming or I'll kill you, and I'm totally seeing stars, like I can see them and remember them. And then it dawns on me. I'm like, oh. And then, like, when he releases his hands and, like, the blood is allowed to go back into my brain, I, like, go over to the far side of the room and grab a bunch of cigarettes and just start smoking. Like, a bunch of cigarettes all at the same time. Because I'm like, whoa, I need something really powerful to knock me out here. Like, because I can't handle this vibe. And, I think like that happened after he did this weird thing where he picks up the ground line phone, dials 911, and says there's a hysterical woman here who needs an ambulance. She won't stop screaming. Click. And like gives the address or something. And then he cuts the cord so like nobody else can make any report. On that line, then he and his friend promptly grab some clothes and hop in the car, which has my purse and my wallet. And they speed away. And then the little boy whose apartment had been broken into, who had actually given a ride home a few weeks before. And I knew him. I knew he was cool. Like, he had the same issues I did. He was sick of this town and whatever. Like, I was like, who are these people? And why are they in your apartment? And he's like, they break in. They break the lock on my door. And I don't know who they are. And they took my keys or something like that. And so then he helped me get dressed. And then, like, this ambulance and everything show up. Then I'm taken away, like, as the hysterical woman. And so I find out later, when I'm being photographed, all the bruises all over my entire body. I'm being photographed. One of the technicians at this hospital is like, oh, well, you fought the police and you're a violent person, and that's why we had to have you stripped naked so we could photograph all those bruises. And then I was completely in shock for about a week, like, could not speak one word, absolutely not one word. And then when I finally realized I could talk, I said, I think I was raped. And the woman was like, oh, you have a rape fantasy. You have a rape fantasy. And I'm like, oh, really? And so then when I did begin to speak, it was with a severe stutter, and then that was really confusing to me because I always had like a fantastic command of English language was not a problem to me. Like I could pronounce it and speak it and never had any speech impediment other than general shyness as a child. So then that was trouble. And then to make this long story short, I could barely eat anything for months and months, and I knew I would need to eat something, so the only things I could imagine that I could stand to eat were ice cream because it went down slowly, and then a little bit of chocolate. And so I was very thin, delightfully thin, and the corners of my mouth went down like this. And I was so silent and so sad, and that's the story, basically. And then at some point it occurred to me I appreciated my life a little more because it had almost been taken away from me. Then one day I was carjacked and hit over the head and had my purse and phone stolen, and I was like, oh, that was nothing. That was nothing compared to being raped and strangled and beaten and screamed at by a maniac. And I think like this whole story is why I don't like abusiveness within my classroom setting. So if this is the film that I submit to the LACC Denim Day thing, I think they need to realize that their professors are dealing with rape victims. A lot of us. There are a lot of rape victims out there. So when they want to speak sexistly and talk about whores and sluts and tits and ass, they need to really go shove it because they don't know what we've been through. Like, men too. Like, one of my biggest heroes was a man who was raped and had the courage to fight his school administration, which protected his abusers. And one day I just looked at his face and he looked at me like, you don't know. And I went home and looked him up on the stupid internet thinking, oh, I want to know what his film career is like. Maybe he made a cool movie. And then I was like, oh, he had the courage to fight this big system that was hell-bent on abusing little children. And like, we barely transacted any words ever. But it was a really big heft of a story to know what he had been through and know what he did to fight for sexual abuse survivors. I hope there's some good films for this.